This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
Travel. We all do it. Where is it we're going to or getting away from? One famous quote says, "Not all who wander are lost." We talk with a wildlife biologist from Kentucky who spent his summer in Kenya. We go inside outdoors to see what he saw and how it's opened his eyes to the work he does back home with the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And your backyard, where home meets habitat. It's all ahead on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Uncle Chuck, what is fall?
Fall means football, but excitement doesn't end there. This is when Kentucky's outdoors are just getting started. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you lakes and streams are alive with fall fishing. And for many, the biggest game of the season is white-tailed deer. Get your fishing and hunting license and get your game plan together this fall. Take aim on a winning season at fw.ky.gov.
Skydiving, motorcycles, I love it. But none of that's as scary as telling someone what they don't want to hear.
Helicopter rescue swimmer Mike Bayersky, United States Coast Guard.
Boating fatalities leave everyone speechless. Jet skiing, tubing, fishing, canoeing. If you hit the water to wind up or to wind down, I'm never scared to say, make sure your life jacket's got your back.
Kentucky conservation officers remind you your life jacket's got your back and the backing of the best swimmers everywhere. This is Kentucky Afield Radio, and by the very name of the show, Kentucky Afield, it's sort of limited to what's going on in Kentucky, bordered by our 7 border states. But the truth of the matter is, we have many animals that live here that actually come from Canada or fly as far south as northern South America. Animals don't always recognize border crossings, nor do wildlife biologists. It's good to get up and get out and get away and take a look at how the other half lives and come home with a little better appreciation for what you have right here. And my guest, Jeffrey Dale Soul, has had quite a journey with his wife, Carol. He is with the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy, a fellow whose work I have admired for many years. There's not a lot of people you talk to say, "What you been doing?" "I just got home from Africa." What were you doing there?
Well, it was strictly a vacation, so it was not a work-related trip. As a matter of fact, it's the most of an actual vacation I've probably ever taken where I did not do any work while I was gone. But it was a great trip. We were gone for a total of about 25 days, 21 days on the ground in Kenya, traveling around the country of Kenya, and it was primarily a birding trip where we focused on trying to see how many of the bird species of Kenya we could locate.
Is that something you just wake up one morning and say, "I think I'll go to Kenya and see how many bird species I can catch"? There has to be some planning to this.
A lot of planning, but fortunately that was done by somebody else.
So
or it probably wouldn't have went so well. What really happened with us is we were fortunate in meeting a young man who actually was born in Zimbabwe, and then his family moved to Kenya. He grew up in Kenya, and he came over here and went to the University of Kentucky to get a degree in environmental resources. And he was a super birder, liked to get out and look for birds in Kentucky, and I got to know him over the last couple of years. And it turns out that his name is Stratton Hatfield. And Stratton would go back home to Kenya in the summer times, and he worked as a guide for safari companies, looking at the big game and the big animals and so forth. But his true passion is birding. And at least initially here out of college, he is thinking about getting into guiding for birding, people that like to go birding, as a profession. And so we were his first official trip that he had totally organized and set up, and he did a fantastic job.
He beta tested on you and came through with flying colors.
Absolutely.
Were you more impressed with his country or he more impressed with ours here in the United States? What do you think?
Oh, that would be a tough call.
Is it apples and oranges, or is this state more like foreign countries than you may realize? I've not been to Kenya to know.
Well, it's apples and oranges for sure, comparing Kentucky to Kenya. I've been on a couple other trips out of the country where I think there are a lot of similarities. And that would be more like Costa Rica or Guatemala. Kenya, the big thing there that just really was awe-inspiring and took me sort of by surprise, I guess. I wasn't expecting it to be as awe-inspiring as it was. It's just such a huge scale of the ecosystems that are still functioning and intact, especially the grassland ecosystems. And it can make you imagine what the middle of the United States might have used to look like.
What Kansas, Oklahoma may have been.
Yeah, Nebraska and so forth, where our prairies were. Those grassland systems in Kenya are still intact. They're still being, there's a lot of development and things that are impacting those areas, but the scale of what is still intact there, the Serengeti and so forth, is just truly amazing.
These are words that we hear only when we're watching the National Geographic Channel. These aren't words we use in Kentucky every day, the Serengeti. I would imagine some of the animals that you were about to mention, we only would see in zoos or at Disney World. What did you see there? And I want to get into the bird part of it, but when you say habitats that are still intact, what did you see there?
Of the big impressive animals, we saw most everything that you might expect or hope to see. We were extremely lucky and saw things in one trip that many people go many times and still don't see. So we were very lucky on our trip. We saw forest elephants and savanna elephants. We saw lions. We saw a leopard. We saw 2 different species of hyena, jackals.
Zebra?
Lots of zebra. There were two species of zebra at least. That is what I recall off the top of my head right now. But one of them was just called the common zebra, and it's the most common around. There was another one called a grevy zebra, I believe, that was much less common, and we saw a few of those also.
Gazelle?
Giraffes.
Giraffes
were just, they're like alien species. You look at them and you think they're moving in slow motion because they're so big and graceful, but they're really moving at a pretty good clip when they're moving around, and just amazing animals. We did see gazelles. We saw Thompson's gazelle, Grant's gazelle, several other, lots of different antelope species. We saw little tiny antelopes called dick-dicks that were just hilariously funny. We saw 2 fighting, which Stratton Hatfield, our guide, it's the first time he had ever seen that, but they were ramming their heads together and fighting and acting like they were big ferocious animals, but little tiny guys.
I can imagine, because I've been to zoos and seen the animals you describe. But again, that was a zoo. I cannot imagine what you just saw when you say the expanse of these habitats. And these critters are not there behind walls or fences. They're there on their own. This is where habitat indeed is still in balance.
Yeah, definitely no fences. This is animals. These animals are wild, free roaming. Of course, huge migrations of a lot of these animals still take place. Lots of Cape buffalo, wildebeest, again, a lot of different types of antelopes, and I could refer to notes and probably name off a whole bunch more, but just really impressive that these animals could be moving. You might look out across the big wide landscape and see 10 or 15 different species of these animals at various points on the horizon or in between you and the horizon. So it was just really impressive. I think the scale of what you see there is just the most amazing part.
What's the most expansive place you have seen during your work as a wildlife biologist in Kentucky? For some reason, the Peabody Wildlife Management Area comes to mind, but there could be any number of others.
Well, Peabody is definitely a huge open landscape. Of course, it's highly altered. It was a coal mine. And as far as grasslands go, probably the most impressive grassland in Kentucky, and it's partially in Tennessee, is at Fort Campbell. And there are places you can go at Fort Campbell. There's a fire tower that you can go on and look out over their bombing range, where you're not allowed to go on foot or anything because of ordinances that are there. But you can probably look at a swath of grassland on Fort Campbell that's a few miles wide and maybe 10 or 12 miles long, and you can pretty much look out and see it all.
Wildlife biologist Jeff Soule is my guest. We're talking about 25 days in the East African Serengeti. It's good to have an end to the journey, Ernest Hemingway says, but it's the journey that matters in the end. We'll have more in a moment on Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio's Charlie Baglan talking about travels. I have a wildlife biologist in the studio with me who has just been in Eastern Africa, in the country of Kenya. The traveler sees what he sees. The tourist sees what they've come to see. And Jeff, it sounds like that your eyes were open as you and your wife traveled about Kenya. I want to hear more about the large-scale habitats. We're talking the huge, large-scale habitats, and where Kentucky fits in. You'd mentioned Fort Campbell. Where else?
And then the other place might be, on Pine Mountain or something, when you're at the top of Pine Mountain or Black Mountain, and you're just looking out over the overall Cumberland Mountains or Cumberland Plateau, and it gives you a feeling of a big, intact forest system. That could maybe sort of equate, but at the same time, it's very fractured with roads and things that you don't see over where we were in Kenya. There you might be on what serves as a road. Most of them were just barely trails, and you can park and look basically in a 360-degree circle, and as far as you could see to the horizon would still be just a big grassland or a savanna or that sort of thing. Now Kenya's forest system is nearly totally gone. So almost all of their forests have been cleared, destroyed, and that's where a lot of corn and ag crops and things are grown, and a lot of people seem to live in those more mountainous areas that used to be really tropical forests. You think of Kenya being Serengeti, very dry desert, but it's also on the equator. We must have crossed the equator 10 or 15 times during our trip, and we went to what should have been large cloud forests, very humid tropical forest systems that were mostly just very small remnants. But we went there to try to find some special birds. That's the only place that are left in Kenya.
I never knew that you were a birder. Is that something you've always had an interest in?
Well, I'm a wildlife biologist, general ecologist, outdoor person. I've always had interest in birding. I did not actively bird as aggressively as I do these days for years and years, but I've always birded some, kept a little bit of a list of the birds I'd seen in Kentucky or in the United States. And then just in the last 5 to 10 years, I've gotten more serious about birding as a way to go see other places. And so it's really the way my wife Carol and I have begun to do a little traveling, and we will go to a place using birding as a way to see the country, make sure you get around to all the different habitat types, see what all's going on in a place.
You can go to foreign countries and travel around to see architecture, take part in its culinary cuisine, if you like food, snow skiing, scenery, foreign language, different currency. That is an experience that everyone should experience at some point in their life. And you did it because you wanted to see different habitats and birds. Was it something you wish you had a little bit more than 25 days to do?
Certainly.
So is this type of trip, Jeff, something that you would recommend? Because I know you got to save your money for a day or two to be able to afford such a vacation.
I would highly recommend this to anybody interested, in the natural world, especially, and seeing huge grassland systems, even more especially maybe, that are still intact. and still functioning the way they should be. I would also highly recommend the young man I worked with. I don't know if he's going to stay in this and do this as a profession, but he did just a super job. He grew up in the area, has local connections. His mom and dad are from Kentucky, and that's how he ended up coming back to the University of Kentucky for his part of his education. You know, they went over there as missionaries years ago, back in the 70s, and they've never come back. So Stratton was born there in Zimbabwe, grew up in Kenya, has dual citizenship, but you know, so he's in a lot of ways he's like talking with somebody from here in Kentucky, because his mom and dad grew up here and he has those influences. But over there he speaks Swahili as fluently as anybody in the world, and it was amazing just to, you know, his connections and the people he had that he could introduce us to, and the places he could show us.
What did you bring back from there that you're going to apply to your work with the Nature Conservancy, you think?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, the Nature Conservancy is also active in Kenya. It may be, I mean, there's things we've been considering at the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy, how we might help with the Africa program. Now, it wasn't specifically Kenya, but we've been talking about that now for a number of years, and particularly with some of our fire program. These grasslands have still, you know, over there they're still functioning largely with lightning fires and so forth, but there's beginning to be the effort we saw in the United States where fire suppression is starting to happen there. So they're starting to need that educational component about keeping fire in the system and not getting people used to it not being there like we have in the United States. So there may be some role that I can help play, or the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy can help play with that in the future. As far as bringing things back from over there, you know, that's a tougher call. You know, what are they doing that we're not doing here or doing better? That's hard to say. It's just that their systems are so huge. They have opportunity over there to work at much larger scales. I wish we had that here.
Well, you can go to Montana and you can see wildlife in balance and habitats intact. I want to say, am I wrong?
I think that's right, but you still have, you know, there's efforts in Montana and South Dakota, North Dakota right now to do grassland prairie restoration at a large scale where animals could actually migrate and move and not have fences and roads and things that deter that movement. There's not really, maybe Yellowstone and, you know, some of that system at the national park level where things are still functioning sort of at that scale. But that's still not quite big enough.
It must be a big place over there.
It's huge.
I would love to see it.
Well, you need to. Again, I recommend it to anybody.
You saw birds there. If we were in Kentucky, we're talking about blue jays, robins, cardinals, warblers, and red-headed woodpeckers, and these words are just common. We have heard them all our life. But to Stratton Hatfield, who comes here, those were new and foreign and exotic to him. And when you went to Kenya, the birds you saw there, you've never seen before. I trust that there are no birds that Kentucky shares in common with Kenya.
Well, there are actually a few.
Really?
But very few.
What are they?
We, while we were there, as I remember, we ended up as a group, a birding group, we came up with about 650 species of birds in Kenya, which is that's a really good effort.
I've got a note. Hang on. I have a note. Brainerd Palmer Ball with the Kentucky Ornithological Society, and I would venture to say the state's authority on songbirds, birds, says 360 species will wander in and out of our state. They may not live here resident, but they will migrate in the winter, fly home in the spring, that type of thing. And you're saying you saw 650? That's almost twice.
Yeah, Kentucky's bird numbers are right where you were talking, 360, 365, somewhere in that range. That birds that either breed in Kentucky or migrate through our state. And Kenya probably has 1,200 or so birds that migrate through, or if you did a similar analysis for Kenya. So what we were looking at was mostly their resident breeding birds, because the migration period for birds was largely over by the time we got there. And we still missed a lot, but we saw a tremendous number. You ask about commonality. There are just a few bird species that occur in the United States that you might see, or you could see in Kenya also, and we saw a couple of those. One of them
is osprey among them.
Osprey is in Kenya. We did not see one. There was a tern, a black tern, or a Caspian tern is one that is here in Kentucky that is also in Kenya. Just a very few, but my personal list for that trip was 615 birds, and 607 of those were birds I had never seen before. So, some people compete with other people, I guess, in birding and bird numbers, but really it's all about your personal life list. Trying to come up, see as many as you can, document it as well as you can. And it's all at a personal level.
JD, we got to take a break. We'll talk about more similarities with Kenya and Kentucky, and what we can learn from each other. This is Charlie Baglan. Stay with us. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. You can probably tell I like to travel. Don't do it as much as I would like. Some people don't like really to travel at all. They're homebodies. Some folks have had some astute things to say about travel. Kid is coming home from school, stops at a field, picks some wildflowers of some description, takes them home to his mother, hands them to her. Dear, she says, you could have picked the same flowers from our backyard. And the kid looks at her and says, but Mom, the journey is part of the gift. So there are a lot of good things that can be said for traveling. Go someplace you've never been sometime. Doesn't have to be summer. It can be winter, fall, doesn't matter. Even if that's the next county over. Invite someone to Kentucky that you haven't seen for a while from out of state, and see your Kentucky from their perspective. Maybe invite them to go fishing.
At Lake Cumberland, the striped bass fishing has been good pretty much all year, and it continues to be good. Most of the fish are being caught on live bait if you can catch them, or on drifting curly-tail grubs on downriggers. Fish are anywhere from about 30 feet down to 50 or 60 feet, and it appears that a lot of the fish have moved down closer to the dam in recent weeks. Also hearing a few walleye being picked up, but it's been relatively slow on the walleye. They can be found 25 to 35 feet deep, catching them on deep diving crankbaits or night crawler rigs on bottom bouncers. Elsewhere in the district, if you'd like a place to take your family for some panfish fishing, Lake Linville's hard to beat during the summertime. It's got a good bluegill population. They can be caught around the shoreline on crickets or worms. Linville's recently been updated at the dock and looks nice, so I encourage you to go by there and take a visit. As always, good luck and good fishing.
This is Jeff Crosby with the Central District Fishing Report. Fishing across the district is very good at many of our area lakes, such as Taylorsville, Gist, Elmer, Beaver Lake. Many fish are being caught early in the morning or late in the evening on topwater. However, crankbaits, especially on points, are catching us several fish, as well as night fishing with soft plastics. Catfishermen at Taylorsville are catching a few blue catfish and channel catfish, fishing cut shad in 6 to 12 feet of water. Channel cats are being caught on flats, whereas blues are generally caught along the creek or river channels. And finally, don't forget about your local streams, such as Elkhorn Creek or Floyd's Fork. This is a great time of year to get out and enjoy some great fishing along some of these streams. Just remember to always ask for permission when entering private property. So grab a pole and enjoy some great summertime fishing.
Hi, this is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Barren River Lake Thermocline is near. About 20-foot bass are taking topwaters early and late, and then deep diving crankbaits till about mid-morning. The night bite has been good with single-bladed spinner baits and plastic worms on the main lake and secondary points. Bluegill have been fair with crickets and worms, and catfish have been good on cut bait with jugs or hook and line. Green River Lake bass have been fair on top waters early and late, and soft plastics like grubs, tubes, and worms late in the day and at night. Cumberland River tailwater trout fishing is still very good throughout the tailwater with either bait, spinners, or small crankbaits. If conditions allow, try fishing for big browns at night with some large crankbaits. As always, good luck and good fishing. Be sure you wear your life jacket.
Kentucky Afield Radio, Charlie Baglin, and we continue our conversation with Jeff Soule after the break. Navy Air Rescue swimmer Luigi Caprio.
If it's 2 a.m., a tsunami, or freezing cold, 2 tools make a difference: a calm voice and a life jacket. On a lake or a pleasure boat, there may come a time you're called upon to do my job. Accidents happen. I am a rescue swimmer, and I am here to help you. Life jackets. They live up to their name every day and night.
Kentucky Fish and Wildlife reminds you, your life jackets got your back, and the backing of the best swimmers everywhere.
This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and my mama always said, broaden your horizons. Well, my guest, Jeffrey Soule, certainly knows that lesson. He and his wife, Carol, have just recently returned to the United States from safari in Africa, in Kenya. 25 days of bird watching and wildlife exploration. I have been familiar with Jeffrey Dale Soule's passion for wildlife biology for more than 2 decades. And it's a pleasure to welcome the man behind the mic. In Kentucky, the big birds are, well, wild turkey's a big boy.
Yes.
Goose, bald eagle, a hawk, cranes. These are big birds. How do they rank in size compared to some of the big boys you saw in Kenya?
Well, some of them would be very similar. Kenya has a lot of raptors. We saw lots of hawks and eagles that were very large. Of course, probably the largest bird we saw there was the ostrich. Ostrich, I don't know how much those things weigh, but when you see them out in the wild, you might see them next to a herd of cattle or next to gazelles and other wildlife, and they are just the size of those ostrich are incredible.
How tall do they stand?
They're about 8 foot, 6 to 8 feet high. And probably weigh, my guess would be 500 pounds, 400 or 500 pounds.
And that is a non-flying bird.
That's correct. And then there's several. They have a bird called the quarry bustard, which is the largest flying bird, I think, or second largest flying bird, might have been what we were told. And, and it's a large, mostly ground-dwelling raptor. But, so that was pretty cool. The secretary bird.
Well, you say big. How big was it compared?
I think they weigh a little over 40 pounds.
Wingspan?
Probably 6 to 8 feet.
Well, Kenya's on the coast of eastern Africa. So there has to be a lot of shorebirds, gulls.
Yeah, there are. And the normal trip that most people take there does not include the coast. So, and that's what we had originally planned, and it was, so you would have seen the tropical part of the mountains and the forested areas, and then seen the grasslands and the desert area, the Serengeti part. We extended our trip by about 4 or 5 days and made a coastal trip to the Indian Ocean just because we wanted to see those habitats and pick up some of those other birds that are out on the coast. And that probably allowed us to get about another 100 species or so of birds.
In Kentucky, the Nature License Plate Program, when it started back in the middle 90s, had a Kentucky warbler on it, a little yellow bird. And the story that went along with that is that it was a neotropical migratory songbird, which is a fancy way of saying it doesn't live here in the winter. And it flies somewhere in the south where it is warm. That's Mexico or northern South America, I'm not sure. The argument was because it depends on Kentucky's forest systems for a home, we need to pay attention to our habitat here locally to give it a place to fly home to. Now, I don't know if Central Africa has that type of concern. If the habitats are intact, maybe they're not worried about what's going on in Italy or Johannesburg.
A lot of the birds that come and you might say winter in Kenya or further south in Africa that just move through Kenya back to Europe, their more limiting habitat is in the European end. where, with a lot of the North American, South American, Central America migratory birds, I think we have limiting factors on both ends with a lot of the things that's going on in the tropical forest and so forth, deforestation and things. But more constraining even for those is still in the North American side, I would say.
Now that you're home, does it make you see Kentucky's habitat and wildlife from a different perspective?
What I saw over there was, and recognized the most, was things happening at a big scale. And whether it was the migration of the animals, and you see it with the large animals that move through that country. The most direct tie that you can make here, and I mentioned earlier, is with our Appalachian Mountain System. And that's an area that we at the Nature Conservancy and the department also is very focused on, and some of our other partners, whether it's the Nature Preserve Commission or Kentucky Natural Land Trust and other partners that we work with. The Appalachian Mountains, we have a huge project we call the Central Appalachians that the Nature Conservancy focuses efforts on, and it's from Pennsylvania through West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, and western Virginia. And so you have this fairly intact large forest system here in the United States that is one of the hot spots for species diversity. A lot of these neotropical migrant birds that you're talking about are totally dependent on the forest system of the Appalachians. And so it's a system that's fairly intact. It does have huge threats. It already has a lot of impacts of various kinds, whether it's coal mining or just other development in the area that are fragmenting that forest. But if you really look at it at the large whole system scale, there's enough of it still intact that if we focus our efforts, we can work to keep that forest system as a functioning system. So I think maybe the Africa trip, the Kenya, seeing something work at such a large scale there, maybe makes you just realize a little more how important it is to try to think at that big scale.
What's the Nature Conservancy do?
Well, the Nature Conservancy is a worldwide organization. It's the largest nonprofit conservation organization in the world. They work in about 40 countries around the world. Here in the United States, every state has a chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And, I work for the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And the primary focus is to, protect the natural systems, kind of look at the best of what's left, try to protect those systems and work with people to manage them in a way that allows for, human use and human needs, but also protects the biodiversity or the numbers of different types of animals and critters we have, the plants and animals, and protects those habitats so that they're there for future generations to enjoy. So that's what we focus on for the largest part. Now, here in Kentucky, our chapter has 3 primary focus areas, and one of them I mentioned, is the Appalachians. It's basically the Cumberland Mountains and a good chunk of the Cumberland Plateau of Kentucky. The other area that's one of our focus areas is the Green River. And a lot of people don't realize it, but the Green River of Kentucky is one of the highest quality, has the most fish and mussel species. It's one of the best ones in the world. It's a global priority. And it's right here in our backyard. The Green River has over 70 mussel species in it, which, a dozen or so of those are endangered and needing, habitat improvement to bring them back to good levels. Has 150 or so fish species, a lot of crayfish and different kinds of aquatic things in the Green River, some of them that you don't find anywhere else in the world. So it's a high priority of ours and where we focus a lot of our work. And then our third priority is clear out in the far western end of the state, and it's on the tributaries to the actual Mississippi River. And we're working really hard out there to work with partners like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, various other folks to restore wetlands. And really that is aimed still at water quality and trying to look at the whole Mississippi River system. And, we have this huge problem down the Gulf of Mexico that's called hypoxia. It's a big dead zone in the Gulf that's a result of our agricultural runoff up here in Kentucky and Illinois and Indiana and Ohio and so forth. The work we're doing there is to try to reduce nutrients and sediment and things from entering the stream so that we can help improve the water quality of the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico.
I've been told one thing that gives the Nature Conservancy a leg up is that you're not government. You're a private organization. And if you want, at a whim, you see land for sale, you can buy it. Whereas there are a lot of hoops if you're, well, let's say a government agency, even maybe the U.S. Forest Service. But you could buy that, hold it, and then hand it off down the road to an agency such as the Nature Preserves Commission that could make use of it and manage it properly. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's a function the Nature Conservancy in all states, but here in Kentucky we certainly have functioned in that capacity a lot. We can move faster than a state agency or a federal agency to protect some land. When a high priority piece of ground comes for sale and the landowner's not willing to wait long enough for the state or federal agency to put together the money and get through the process, we can move a little quicker, maybe go ahead and buy that land, hold on to it to then eventually sell it back to the agency that is wanting to have that. We're working right now with Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. We helped with the original purchase out at Sturgis, and are hoping to continue to work out there to help put together a larger wildlife management area in that Sturgis area. So we've done that with the Daniel Boone National Forest, the Nature Preserves Commission, different landholding agencies that are in the state. That is a role the Nature Conservancy can play.
For anybody wanting to find out more about the Nature Conservancy, what's that web address?
Nature.org.
Nature.org.
And that takes you to the larger organization's webpage, and then you can click on any state or any country that we work in and get all kinds of information about what the Nature Conservancy is doing.
But what's the saying, Jeff? Think globally, act locally?
Yeah, that's right.
I think you've done that, and we'll continue. Do you have another trip planned?
Not yet. We don't know what we'll do next, other than there's still a lot of the United States we haven't seen, so I think we're going to hang around in this country for our next couple trips, but still trying to add to that bird list out west.
Jeffrey Soule, thanks so much for coming by.
Oh, you're welcome.
We'll be back with more in a minute. This is Charlie Baglin on Kentucky Afield Radio. Our backyard, where home meets habitat. This week on Kentucky Afield Radio. While our houses may be home to you and me, our backyards can be home to wildlife.
Most people want to see all sorts of songbirds. Some people like chipmunks showing up, rabbits. Butterflies are another thing that people like to attract.
Laurie Davison is the director of the Salado Wildlife Education Center in Frankfort. She says that attracting wildlife to a wildlife center poses the same challenges as attracting wildlife to our yards. She says there are 4 keys. Wildlife needs food, water, shelter, and space.
Suet is almost like candy to birds in a way. They love it. Woodpeckers visit suet regularly. Cardinals like suet. Jays like suet.
Hummingbirds are now making their return to Kentucky. It's a long flight from their wintering habitat down south, and they're working up a thirst along the way.
It is very important to clean a hummingbird feeder. The longer you leave them out with sugar water in them, the more likely they are to develop bacteria, which can be harmful to the birds. Since red is attractive to the birds, they like to put red dyes into sugar water. That's actually not a good idea. The red dyes are sometimes harmful to the bird's digestive tracts, so it's better to use the red elsewhere.
Keep in mind a red bottle or a red bottle holder will do the job. What Laurie is doing is drawing upon tips and how-to information from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife's Backyard Wildlife Program. A nectar feeder, which is a more proper term for a hummingbird feeder, provides water, which is the second item on the list. Laurie says that even if it's just a shallow pan, water makes a real splash with wildlife.
You don't want to fill it all the way up. Birds actually prefer that you only have about an inch of water in the bottom of this. but this will also provide water for other garden wildlife, things like squirrels, raccoons, chipmunks, things of that nature. So this is a good thing to have on hand.
Small mammals and some birds rely on shelter for survival. You can create this shelter by leaving a brush pile in the back corner of your property. Another idea is to simply stop mowing the lawn, or at least some of it.
No-mow zones are actually great. For one thing, it keeps you from having to mow as much of your yard. Also, the no-mow zones provide a variety of shelter-type habitat for wildlife. Rabbits and ground squirrels, they need a place to get away from predators, things like hawks that might fly in, things like your domestic house cat or dog.
Laurie says when a patch of ground is just left to grow, you can be surprised at the wildflowers that will surface, wildflowers that you used to call weeds. Finally, space. Even critters need a little elbow room.
When you're hanging a variety of feeders, it's very important to hang them at different levels. Different birds feed at different levels, and so that's something you might consider. Some birds, such as mourning doves, feed on the ground. Other birds prefer to be high up in the branches.
Remember, not all wildlife is actually desirable. Depending on where you live and what you put out as treats, you could attract visits from bears, skunks, coyotes, even possums.
They have a reputation for getting in garbage cans and things like that. They also have a reputation for being disease carriers. They prefer old, rotting food to anything else. They're not big feeders on birdseed.
Food, water, shelter, and space. That's the perfect combo for wildlife habitat. And that's true whether you're in your backyard or in the backwoods. The great outdoors can begin at your doorstep, and your local garden center can help you get started. To learn more about backyard wildlife, log on to kyafield.com.
That backyard wildlife program, it's not just limited to spring or summer. It doesn't matter what time of the year it is. There's always something that is interested to coming to your yard to visit. If you're thinking on a little broader scale, plant winter wheat this fall for wildlife, so says the headline. Dateline, Frankfort, Kentucky. The heat of summer is a good time to begin thinking about fall plantings to benefit wildlife. Winter wheat is the top choice for fall crop because it is readily eaten by deer and wild turkey and is an excellent nurse crop for clover. Winter wheat is typically planted August 15th through October 31st. Private Lands wildlife biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Joe Lacefield, says, I recommend planting clover at the same time you plant the wheat. The clover will take root over the winter and come on the next spring when the wheat starts to die back. Winter wheat has been the cover crop of choice to benefit wildlife, high in protein and easily digestible. Other outdoor news you may have heard of: if you fish for trout or catfish, you may have seen this in your mailbox already. Angler surveys on catfish and trout are being mailed out. A randomly selected group of catfish and trout anglers in Kentucky have been sent a survey to gauge their thoughts on the management of those two species. These surveys are a great way for anglers to provide feedback to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This according to fisheries biologist and trout expert Dave Reeves. We really want people to respond to these angler attitude surveys because they help gauge public opinion on management issues. Forms have been sent to 1,800 catfish anglers and the same amount of trout permit holders. If you've seen one of these in your mailbox, fill it out, send it in. Participants with questions about the survey may call Mr. Dave Reeves at the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's something else of interest in the news. Biologists are battling invasive plants on wildlife management areas. We use the word exotic as if it were magic, wonderful, better than what you may be able to get commonly every day. Exotic. In the field of biology, exotic is more of a negative term. If something is exotic, that means it's not from here. A plant, for example, or a bird. It has sort of found its way here by accident. And the things that sort of keep it in check, the animals or other plants or the weather or what have you, didn't come with it. And so it's sort of free to proliferate. And that's what this news story is about. Imported plants, which have established footholds in Kentucky fields and in forests, pose a threat to the state's native plants and animals. A habitat team from the department's Wildlife Diversity Program have completed hundreds of acres of invasive species removal. Exotic invasive plants can damage natural systems, The effects are cumulative. It's much easier and cost-effective to remove and control invasive species before they become established. Bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle impacts wildlife by shading out everything in the understory. That means down close to the ground, eliminating other plants that wildlife need to thrive. These would be plants that are beneficial to rabbits, quail, songbirds, and other wildlife. In 2008, the Kentucky Exotic Pest Plant Council, I bet you didn't even know they existed. The Kentucky Exotic Pest Plant Council declared that 92 species in Kentucky were considered exotic invasive plants, and otherwise shouldn't be here, and are sort of crowding out the plant life that is native to Kentucky. So hats off to the guys in the field doing the work. We are out of time. My name is Charlie Bagwin. Please join us again in a week. We will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.